Let's go to the next story. This is a very important one. Reporter Ken Klippenstein has been staying on this and has actually uncovered some really crazy data. Let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen. The FBI is hoovering up DNA at a pace that rivals China and currently owns 21 million samples and counting. One of the reasons I actually found the story especially fascinating is it details the Byzantine laws which the FBI is using, both in loopholes and also explicitly, to gain more DNA samples from American citizens at a faster pace than ever before. He writes, quote, that the FBI aims to nearly double its currently $56 million budget for dealing with the DNA catalog, with an additional $53 million per year for its budget request of fiscal year 2024. In an April 23 statement to Congress, the FBI revealed that the significantly expanded DNA processing requirements of the FBI and were collecting some 90,000 samples per month. Some of this, Krystal, is based upon federal law, where there is a database of the combined DNA index system that goes across all 50 states, which stipulates that originally, just if you were a violent or a sexual offender, they were going to take a DNA sample for you for reference in the future. That eventually was then lowered down to like the misdemeanor level of crime. It eventually got to the point where if you are now even a person of interest in a crime, even if you've never been convicted in a crime, that you can have your DNA legally obtained. And is now expanding to the point where even in airports and in ports of entry, they are hoovering up DNA samples and basically through a quasi-legal loophole are expanding this with no recourse, no due process about the invasive privacy nature of any of this, that rapidly expands so they can just do with this data for whatever purposes that they want. And don't forget, there was, I forget which, it was the Golden State Killer, I want to say, the serial killer, who they were able to find him decades after he had committed his last crime, and he was a horrible serial killer, to be clear, where they checked his past DNA against open databases of like Ancestry.com, of like people who had submitted samples. They were able to obtain like a search warrant or whatever for these, and were able to connect it back to him via a semi-distant relative of his who had submitted their DNA to one of these like Ancestry websites, which raised a lot of questions. You know, I'm not saying it wasn't good that we caught him. I think it's great. I think he'll die in jail, and that's good, especially recourse for his victims. But it really opened my eyes, that particular case, where I'm like, wow, man. I mean, the way that they are able to use this, it doesn't just implicate you. I mean, if they even have a very distant relative or whatever of yours, they can quite easily use that should they ever want to in any of these types of scenarios. Very creepy when you start to think about it.
I think there's a lot to say about this. First of all, your comments about where this started and where this ended up really illustrates the problem, the slippery slope with the security state. So it starts in a place that basically everyone would support, like sex offenders.
Right.
We're taking their DNA, right? We're gonna track this. We're gonna keep track of it to try to protect the public, and it would be
reasonable.
It'd be very hard to find a person who could be like, no, you're not gonna do that. But you start in this place that is 100% justifiable and that would have broad public support. And then over the years, it just expands and it expands and it expands and it expands and it expands. And another thing that comes out of this is part of why their DNA tracking and database has really exploded in recent years. Not all of, but part of why is because under Trump, there was an order to start collecting the DNA information of undocumented immigrants. So this program starts under Trump. At the time, because it's Trump, it's very controversial. Well, guess what? Now Biden's in office. He's kept the same order in place, and no one says shit about it.
Right.
So it just continues to expand. The other piece of this is now, obviously, you know, the technology has gotten much better. It's become much easier and much faster with a lot less resources expended in order to catalog and identify DNA. So as the technology, actually we have a quote from this article that makes this point exactly. They say the database is likely to continue proliferating as DNA tech becomes more sophisticated, pointing to the advent of environmental DNA, which allows for DNA to be collected for ambient settings like wastewater or air. Goes on to say just by breathing, you're discarding DNA in a way that can be traced back to you. So as the technology becomes more sophisticated and more seamless, you can expect this program only only to expand further. There's been an effort to increase the budget around collecting and tracking and storing all of this information. And, you know, on the what people would say on the other side is, hey, you pointed to the Golden State serial killer. Isn't it good that we were able to identify this person and bring them to justice after all of these years? Isn't that a good thing? Of course it is. But it's also important to keep in mind, number one, that on the other side of the ledger is the millions and millions of completely innocent people who now the government has all of this personal, private information about. That's number one. But number two, DNA hasn't even been that effective overall in terms of identifying those who committed crimes and prosecuting them. Ken writes in this piece, DNA has played an important role, but less than 3% of the profiles have assisted in cases. By comparison, fingerprints collected by the FBI from current and former federal employees linked them to crimes at a rate of 12% each year, according to testimony from the Bureau back in 2004, when fingerprint technology was far less sophisticated. The implication being that it probably is an even higher match rate at this point. So, you know, it's really troubling. Our own intelligence agencies raised a lot of justified questions and concerns about the rate at which China was hoovering up all of and tracking all of this DNA information from their own citizens. And it turns out we're doing the exact same thing at the exact same pace and rate and size and scope and scale.
Yeah, that's the creepy part too about about the way that it's collected. And one of the important things to underscore about what you said is, you know, we have this idea from TV and from movies that it is used, you know, to great effect in many cases, and it is in some murder and rape investigations. But the vast majority of crimes and stuff don't entail those. Those are actually quite rare, you know, on a macro scale. So then it comes to the question of like, well, what are we going to do with all this? And then also, to what end, you know, in the future? I've told the story before about how, you know, I entered into the United States from Mexico. I was coming in through a port of entry, and even though I'd never signed up for global entry and I'd never, you know, given any facial recognition or whatever, my face was used in a pilot program by the CBP, or yeah, I think it was the CBP when I was re-entering the United States. And I had never consented to any of this. Yeah. And they're just straight up using facial recognition software. Yeah. I mean, it's one of those where like, what? I'm like, I never asked for this. Wait, you know, if they can do this here, what is stopping them from doing the entire country? Actually, the answer is nothing, you know, in terms of whatever, especially when you're coming back in. This is just where it's so direct because you're looking directly into the camera. How many times are you on camera and then somebody is scanning your face? Again, look, you can make a reasonable case. You're like, what? You don't think we should have that for everybody who comes into the country? I don't know. All right. But, you know, at the very least, like there needs to be some actual transparency and investigation or oversight into this, because when you just start collecting vast DNA samples of your entire population to basically no end, and you have this readily accessible to law enforcement, you know, with what do they need in order to tap it? Are we making sure there are proper safeguards and all these things in place? You're real just one step away from a very bad situation where this data is used for nefarious purposes.
And it happens and it expands with no notice, little debate, no explanation to the American people of what the pluses and minuses might be, what the risks and what the benefits are. It just happens. And from, you know, a small program, really targeted, to, you know, basically as much information and data and DNA as they can possibly get their hands on over the course of, you know, several decades. That's how we see the size and scope of the security state just continue to creep and creep and creep across administrations. This one is truly bipartisan, right? Happened under Trump, happened under Biden, I'm sure happened under Obama, certainly happened under George W. Bush. It's the uniparty is really involved in this expansion, and very, very little scrutiny of it ever. So, you know, kudos to Ken Klippenstein for doing this kind of reporting and exposing to all of us what is actually going on here. Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.